Tonight, we'll be debating the question, has justice been done in the case of Shamima Begum? I'm just going to lay out some quick facts before we move to the debate at hand. So, when Shamima Begum was 15, she decided to leave the UK with two friends with the goal of joining the Islamic State in Syria. In mid-February of this year, she was found by a Times journalist in a Syrian refugee camp. In response to her public desire to return to the UK, the Home Secretary stripped Ms Begum of her citizenship in late February. He did this under the provisions of the 1981 British Nationality Act, which states that a person can be deprived of their citizenship if the Home Secretary is satisfied that it would be conducive to the public good and that they would not become stateless as a result. She was also denied citizenship by Bangladesh, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said that she was erroneously identified as a Bangladeshi national. Ms Begum has now been living in Syria for almost 4 years and has secured legal aid in order to help her appeal the decision of the Home Secretary who revoked her citizenship. Now tonight we are joined by Ms Webb, who will be speaking in favour of the motion, arguing that justice has indeed been done in the case of Shamima Begum, and Mr Akunjee will be speaking in the opposition. We will now hear initial submissions by both speakers, so I look to Ms Webb to introduce the case for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Ms President, for inviting me to speak here tonight and debate this very important motion. It's my first time debating here at the Union, and I'm so glad it's such an uncontroversial topic. The motion is an interesting one because it naturally wanders into the minefield of what we mean by justice, and this can lead us to focus on the minutiae at the expense of the bigger picture to try and make sense of it all. Has justice been done? I take this to mean, has the Home Secretary made the right decision morally and legally to strip Ms Begum of her citizenship? I agree with Mr Akunjee on many things, and I'm not deaf to his argument. I know that she was 15 at the time she chose to travel, that there were safeguarding failures that could have stopped her from going. I know that she is a mother who's lost 3 children, and I also agree that it is not ideal to play hot potato with people's citizenship, and that it is cause for us to look at why she would want to leave modern Britain to join a barbaric proto-state like the Islamic State. But, ladies and gentlemen, what I often hear in response and opposition to this motion is reductio ad absurdum, squinting at the law and trying to pass the blame. The law is a tool that we use to achieve justice, but they're not. The law and justice is not the same thing. There is a higher moral arbiter of justice that is more than just the black letter of the law. In fact, pernickety legalism can often be the enemy of justice and can be used to evade it. As Tocqueville said, absolute excellence is rarely to be found in any legislation. So let's not reduce things down. Whether or not justice has been done is a question of whether or not the Home Secretary was right to revoke Ms Begum's citizenship under the circumstances and options before us. You are no doubt familiar with the atrocities committed by Islamic State against the people, the citizens of Iraq and Syria, against the Shia, the Sunni, the Christian and Yazidi populations, and the destruction of the diversity of cultures that has existed side by side for hundreds of years in those countries. But to jog your memory a little, I want to take you back to the events of 2014. Just before Ms Begum decided to leave the country in early 2015. On the 3rd of August 2014, there were 400,000 Yazidis living in Sinjar city. And Islamic State believed that the Yazidis are pagan devil worshippers. On the 3rd of August, they attacked Sinjar city, they murdered and raped the people of that city and sent many of them fleeing up into the mountain on Mount Sinjar, where many of them died from starvation and from thirst or from their injuries. And according to some reports, the vast majority of those people were under the age of 15. The UN Independent International Commission inquiry found that it constituted genocide. And according to some human rights organisations, between 2,500 and 5,000 were killed. Over 6,000 were kidnapped. Other estimates suggest almost 10,000 were kidnapped and murdered in just the few days in that August attack. That is 2.5% of the Yazidi population, beheaded, burned and shot. UN figures suggest that 7,000 were forced into sex slavery, many of those young girls and minors. One man told of how his brother, sister, and 56 of his family are still missing. And I'm going to read you a quote because I think that it's important that you hear it from his mouth. He said, "Daesh separated the elderly from everyone else and had buried them alive in a large pit. The little children who refused to separate from their families were buried along with them. Their women were sold on the Sabaya market, which is on the Telegram app. They were sold in warehouses. Disabled girls were sold for pittance. They were passed around like gifts between fighters and as rewards for Quran recitation competitions. They were raped in front of their children, and their children were forced to do dangerous work, preparing explosives that could have exploded in their faces. And I'm talking about 5-year-old children. 19 Yazidi women were burned alive in Mosul for refusing to have sex with the fighters." And it's not just the Yazidis, but also in June 2014, there was an enormous massacre at a camp in Tikrit where 4,000 unarmed Iraqi cadets were stationed, rounded up, put onto trucks, and shot in mass graves in what can only be described as scenes reminiscent of the Holocaust. The Shia and non-Muslims were separated from the Sunnis, and at least 1,566 were murdered. This is systematic ethnic cleansing. Earlier this month, the Archbishop of Erbil came to Civitas, my think tank, to talk about what had happened to the Christians in Iraq. In 2015, there were 1.5 million Christians in Iraq, 6% of the entire population. Today, there are less than 250,000, and that's probably a generous estimate. They crucify people, they put their heads on spikes, they burn them alive, and they drown them in cages. And in the months leading up to Begum's decision to travel, some of the most famous instances of their barbarity were all across our news cycle. In August, the decapitation of James Foley. In September, David Haynes. October, Alan Henning. November, Peter Kassig, the US aid worker. This is what Begum saw. And this is what she saw when she chose to join the group. And she said herself in her interviews that she knew what she was doing, she knew what she was getting herself into. And it was when she got there what she expected, and she said that she enjoyed herself. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think it was that she enjoyed so much? Was it sewing the suicide vests onto people so that they couldn't get out, which is something that one source has suggested that she did? Or was it receiving military and religious training from IS? Did she enjoy being in the Hizbah unit, the morality police, in the all-female Al-Kanza brigade, as some sources on the ground have also suggested? I wonder what she thinks about the fact that that brigade used a giant medieval pincer torture device to bite a 10-year-old Iraqi girl to death for leaving her house, or when a woman in the brigade, when the brigade killed a woman in Raqqa for breastfeeding in public. Perhaps she enjoyed carrying guns and enforcing strict Sharia law. The people in Mosul always paid their electricity bills on time because they were afraid of having their hands cut off if they didn't. And that's the sort of thing that the Al-Kanza Brigade did to the people of Iraq and Syria. An activist in Deir ez-Zor, where Begum lived, said that she was known well to them, that she had a reputation for ordering imprisonment and the lashing of women, and in Raqqa that she carried a gun and was particularly strict. And there was an incident in Al-Amasi Street in Raqqa where she shouted at a woman for wearing brightly coloured trainers. Now, I don't know what happened to that woman in brightly coloured trainers, but I do know that women who violated the dress code were often burned alive. Other sources suggested that maybe she sent messages to European girls trying to recruit them, as one to a girl in Austria in 2015, where she had said to them that the bad things that you hear about Islamic State are fake, and that you have everything that you want here, and we can hook you up with a good-looking husband. This isn't a gap year, ladies and gentlemen. And you have to ask yourself, why does she want to come back now? She admitted in the interviews that she did that she and her husband had opportunities to come back. As Mr. Akunjee knows very well, she didn't want to come home. The reason why she wants to come home now is only because the caliphate has failed. She herself said that she doesn't regret it. She talks about how she is glad that she met her husband there because she wouldn't have found somebody like him back in the UK. Thank God. She had a good time, she said. It fulfilled her aspirations. It was what she expected. Executions, she said she was okay with it and that she thinks it was Islamically allowed. Severed heads in bins, she said it didn't faze her at all. IS attacks on the UK, well, she said that the Manchester attack was essentially tit for tat for coalition airstrikes on IS-controlled territories. She said that she doesn't agree with everything that Islamic State have done, but she does agree with some British values. And even when she criticised IS oppression, and she was asked what she thought about the end of the caliphate, she said she didn't have high hopes. Mr. Akunjee will emphasise that she was a child and that she was groomed. And that certainly is true, that she did radicalise, probably as part of a process amongst her friends. But justice is dependent on recognising moral agency. The age of criminal responsibility in this country is 10. Begum may have been 15 when she travelled, but she was a moral agent. She herself said she knew what she was doing. And she was aware of the IS that she was going to. It was all over the news in 2014. She knew. Mr. Akunjee will call on you to have sympathy for her, but she is not the victim here. Even if she had been a housewife, she still chose to go there and is complicit in the state-building enterprise that led to such horrible crimes against the people of Iraq and Syria. And do not be fooled either by the argument that depriving of her citizenship is any more an appeal to your emotion than is the argument that we should feel sorry for her. Actions have consequences. That is justice. But should we not bring her back and prosecute her then? Well, as Mr. Akunjee, I'm sure, knows, the Met were not on the ground in Raqqa or in Deir ez-Zor in 2015 collecting evidence. And I don't know what you think would happen if she were to return to this country, whether or not justice would be done. But I'm sure, as Mr. Akunjee knows well, only 1 in 10 jihadists returning have been prosecuted. More than 400 have returned. There is a low conviction rate, because evidence is difficult to gather, and this is particularly the case amongst women, because even though we know that foreign women played a large role in ISIS militarily, it's harder to find documentation because they didn't feature in the propaganda in the same way. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not agree with Mr. Akunjee when he asked whether or not Theresa May have Nazi blood running through her veins. But I do concede that the government has failed us, and particularly Theresa May as Home Secretary. Not enough was done to ensure that the right legislation was lined up to ensure that we could deal with these inevitable cases. It's useful that the new 2019 Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act allows the Home Secretary to designate particular areas so that it is illegal for people to go into them or to stay there, but that cannot be enacted retrospectively. Morally speaking, by joining Islamic State, she renounced her loyalty to this country and her right to call it home. Citizenship is fundamentally about loyalty. In a recent policy exchange report, they said that law should recognise and reinforce the duty of non-betrayal, and that this is a reason why we might want to look into updating our treason laws. And perhaps treason laws would be a way of ensuring that justice would be done in the cases of people like Begum. And perhaps if it was the case that she could come back here and receive a hefty jail sentence, then maybe I would be arguing against the motion. But that is not how things are. Sometimes the government get it wrong. And although Mr. Akunjee again has called the Home Secretary vermin, I actually think that he has made the right decision in these circumstances. It is his duty first and foremost to make decisions that protect the British people and are in their best interests. And he has fulfilled that duty. And if he hadn't, and if something had gone wrong, if she had returned, people would have been asking why he hadn't used his legal powers in order to protect us. And finally, I want to draw your attention to one more thing. Mr. Akunjee is going to argue, I'm sure, that the decision is outside of the legal process and that somehow it's outside of the law, but it isn't. That is precisely why it was possible for him to pass her case on to the human rights lawyer Gareth Pearce, who is taking it to the Special Immigration Appeals Commission. That shows that not only was the decision at the time, and I'm sure that we will argue about this more later, at the time it was perfectly legal for him to strip her of her citizenship when it wasn't going to make her stateless. It may be the case that Bangladesh have unlawfully denied her legal entitlement to citizenship there, but that will go to the appeals court and it will all happen within the process of the law, and it isn't something that is taking place outside of it. So I would say that it is not for this House or for Mr. Akunjee to say that the Home Secretary was wrong in making this decision. He had access to far more intelligence than we can consider tonight and far superior legal advice. I ask you, please, when voting for this motion, keep your eye on the bigger picture. As the famous alumnus of this university, Thomas Hobbes, said, hell is truth seen too late. Let us not see the truth of this too late. Ladies and gentlemen, when you vote, I ask you to remember that siding with the perpetrator is not moral sophistication. G.K. Chesterton said that children are innocent and love justice, but the wicked love mercy. Mercy perverted is not mercy, it is a vice. The case is clearly not over, but the Home Secretary's decision was morally and legally right in the circumstances, so I urge you, please vote for this motion.
I'd like to thank Ms. Webb for her speech, and I now look to Mr. Akunjee to introduce the case for the opposition.
I did have a slightly different beginning, but I see that Miss Webb decides to play the man and not the ball. In that, she's been paying particular attention to my Twitter feed. I've tried to look at her Twitter feed, but in the last couple of days it's been made private.
Nothing to do with you, I assure you.
This House believes that justice has been done in the case of Shamima Begum. And a good place to start is at the beginning. What is justice? Every nation has its version of that concept. The North Koreans have a version based on the Soviet model. Saudi Arabia has a version ostensibly based on Sharia. And even ISIS, as we've heard, had their version, and we've all seen on our television screens what that looks like. What we're talking about here today is British justice, and that is of a very different complexion. To discover what that is, we have to cast our minds back and into the history that this country derives its book of codes from. And when we look back, we find Alfred the Great had collected the works of Albert of Kent, Innes of Wessex, and Offa of Mercia in order to formulate the book, or the Dome Book. And in that, together with a dollop of legal guidance from Leviticus, the essence of his trustees was thus: doom very evenly. Do not doom one doom to the rich, another to the poor, nor doom one doom to your friend and another to your foe. In that simple statement, he encapsulated a key function of the law. That is, that the nature of it demands that friend and foe be treated equally under it. In those times, the king was the law and not subject to it. Society, however, evolved, and in 1215 we arrived at a rethinking of the proposition. And this was the Magna Carta, drafted by an Archbishop of Canterbury and signed into force by King John of England. The essential clauses there were that no freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or be disised of his freehold or liberties or free customs, or be outlawed or exiled, or in other way destroyed, nor will we pass upon him nor condemn him by lawful judgment of his peers, except by lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. We will not deny or defer to any man either justice or right. This document enshrined that all men by right were equal under the law, including the king, the executive, and that they had the right to a fair trial. It also necessitated the need for an independent judiciary to decide matters of right. Marching forward with this new system, new in the 12th century, with this idea of independent arbiters, we move into the modern age, where we ask the question, what factors does a decision maker have to use when making their decision? This was settled in a very commonsensical way in the matter of the Wednesbury Corporation in 1948, and very simply, it states that all decisions made by a decision maker must be rational, reasonable, take into account factors that ought to be taken into account, and not take into account factors that ought not to be taken into account. That's the essence of our law, characterized by ration, fairness, and treating friend and foe alike. So how do we decide what factors to consider when it comes to the decision of our Home Secretary in the matter of Shamima Begum? In order to know that, this is driven by the facts of the case itself. So we have to know, what is Shamima's story? Unfortunately, Shamima's story is not the story of an individual. It's actually the story of 9 girls from one inner city school in East London called the Bethnal Green Academy, and actually it begins in December 2014. A friend of Shamima, also called Shamima Begum, and this will become important later, left her home from London, travelled by Gatwick Airport to Istanbul, and though only 15 years old at the time, apparently travelling alone and unassisted, she managed to cross Turkey and enter ISIS-controlled territory in Syria. This fact of her final destination was known only to the Metropolitan Police, her father, and the school administration. The Met launched a terror investigation, which is all but natural in the circumstances. And liaising with the school, they identified 7 girls from Shamima's friendship circle for questioning. Included in that circle were Shamima Begum, unrelated, Khadija Sultana, and Amira Abbas. All 7 girls were questioned by the police without their parents' knowledge. None of these girls were subject to the prevent strategy or safeguarding. In February 2015, when the police realized they might just happen to need the formal consent of the parents, they formulated some letters requesting consent from those parents and handed them, unbelievably, to the girls themselves for delivery. Needless to say, none of those letters ever reached the parents. Not only that, the police failed to even follow up. They didn't think, there are 7 parents here who are not calling us, even though we've sent letters to them. They didn't follow up with that. Unknown to the parents, and under the noses of the Metropolitan Police, 3 of those 7, Shamima, Amira, and Khadija, formulated a plan, and the family believe precipitated by receipt of those letters, to join their friend in Syria. So on the morning of the 17th of February, the girls left home and followed exactly the same route as the December girl, their original friend. Evidently, within a day, the families were aware that their daughters had gone missing. They contacted the police and an investigation was launched. That investigation was a missing persons investigation. It very quickly turned into a counter-terrorism one, and the families were then made aware that their daughters were suspected to be in Syria. This is the first they'd heard about it. It later became apparent from Turkish media that a smuggler who had taken the girls across the border, releasing a video of the same, turned out to be an agent or a spy working for a coalition country. Media reports that that country is Canada. The incident raised such a furore that the Home Affairs Select Committee decided to question all people involved around the actual disappearance of the February girls. So the representatives of the families came together, Mark Rowley, head of Counterterrorism Command, Bernard Hogenhow, the chief of the Metropolitan Police, and Abdurrahman Bilgic, the Turkish ambassador, together with myself, attended that meeting and subjected ourselves to questioning. Mark Rowley, under questioning, made the following statement. We have no evidence in this case that these 3 girls are responsible for any terrorist offences. They have no reason to fear, if nothing else comes to light, that we will be treating them as terrorists. Bernard Hogenhow, the head of the Metropolitan Police, seconded that motion. Now, at the same time that that was happening, Shamima Begum in Syria was being married to a 23-year-old Dutch national in an ISIS-administered ceremony. She was 15 years old. Under Dutch and British law, she's the victim of statutory rape. Out of that union, 2 children were born, 3 and 1 years old. They died. They died from malnutrition and disease. Eventually, in February, Shamima was discovered and interviewed by Anthony Lloyd from the Times newspaper, as we all know. Shamima was heavily pregnant at the time with her 3rd child, and during this interview she raised concerns about her unborn baby, a British citizen who is innocent of any crime. On the 16th of February, Shamima Begum gave birth to her son, Jara, and a few days later, on the 19th, the Home Secretary made the decision to strip her under Section 40 of the Nationality Act. In accordance with that Act, any decision to strip is only valid if it does not leave an individual stateless. That is our international commitment and our domestic law commitment to all our citizens. not to leave them stateless. It is our contention, based upon a press release from the Bangladeshi government, who strongly denied that Shamima Begum was in any way a citizen of Bangladesh at the time of the decision. Sajid Javed left her stateless. On the 22nd of February, Shamima stated in an interview to the Sky News that she was struggling to feed her child and spoke of her own condition of illness. In response to the request from her sister to the British government that we will be dealing with the decision or the lawfulness of that in due course, but in the meantime, to save her child, their nephew, Jeremy Hunt had this to say, declining the request. We have to think about the safety of British officials. I would send them into a war zone as a representative of the government. Now, this is said in the context of 5 interviews by 5 British journalists who had all spoken to Shamima Begum, not a hair on their head harmed. Those are the facts. The question of whether this is justice is a wider issue. It isn't just about Shamima Begum. I completely agree with Emma on this point. It was about a number of people. Jara, her baby, an innocent child who died as a direct consequence of the action of stripping her of her citizenship and the inaction of assisting that child in those circumstances. The decision was unjust to the Kurdish people. They are the ones who have spent blood and treasure in defeating ISIS. They have lost 100,000 of their people, and yet the decision here burdens the Kurdish people with the upkeep and safety of Shamima Begum, who is nothing to do with them. Shamima Begum was born in the UK, raised in the UK, educated in a British school, groomed in the UK, radicalised in the UK. She used a British passport to get to Syria. Beyond that, she didn't pay for those tickets in pounds sterling, in taka, she paid for them in pounds sterling. Yet this decision supposes that she, who's never been to Bangladesh, never held a Bangladeshi passport, doesn't even have a visa there, is the problem of the Bangladeshi state. The arrogance of a decision by a Home Secretary to comment and make a statement about another nation's domestic law and foist our problems upon them is a form of human fly tipping. It's taking a very British problem and illegally dumping it on our innocent neighbours, de facto and de jure.
Both speakers will have now up to 5 minutes to respond to each other, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. So I now look to Ms. Webb to respond. Thank you.
Mr. Akunjee, if I wanted to play the man rather than the ball, those wouldn't have been my choices. It was important to me, of course, to look at your Twitter feed because I needed to know the sorts of things that you would argue. And without going into details, I think it's quite clear that you would like to place the blame anywhere else but on Begum herself. In terms of, and I have to say, I love the fact that you talked about Alfred the Great and Magna Carta. But in terms of Sajid Javid's decision to strip her of her citizenship, at the time when he chose to do that, she was legally entitled to Bangladeshi citizenship. It may be that Bangladesh have been unlawful in refusing her legal entitlement because she has Bangladeshi parents, and so she is entitled to Bangladeshi citizenship. As Mr. Akunjee mentioned, for the obvious reason, the status of her marriage is in doubt, but it might even be the case that she would be entitled to Dutch citizenship. And I totally recognise the desire not to palm our problems off on someone else, but we have to look at the fact that the decision by the Home Secretary at the time when he made it was perfectly legal. And also he has that power for a reason. If it turns out, as Mr. Akunjee has said, that she has been rendered de facto stateless, then this will be amended through the appeals process. We're not debating tonight about justice in general as a butterfly effect of justice. We are talking about, has justice been done in the case of Begum? Not about her baby, which is another debate, and I would be happy to debate you on it. Not about the justice to the Kurds, but about the justice of the decision and whether or not that decision was the morally and legally right thing to do. And I think that it is quite clear that it is. He would like to make it the problem of Tower Hamlets Council, that they didn't stop her from travelling. He would like it to be the police's fault. But the point is that she, as a moral agent at the age of 15, chose to go there and made the decision to go and join a state that everybody knew at the time was absolutely abhorrent. And we cannot just allow people back into this country who go and do that kind of thing. She has turned her back on her country, and arguably de facto, she has revoked her own citizenship. And we don't know how much of a danger she may be to this country, but Sajid Javid does, and he has those powers for a reason. And how just would it be if she were to come back to this country and radicalise young girls here, or boys here? I don't think that we would be having this conversation if she was a 15-year-old boy. We are having this conversation because she is a girl, a woman, a mother. She's being painted as an innocent victim, but the real innocent victims, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, are the people of Iraq and Syria. And I think that Mr. Akunjee is trying to place the blame anywhere except on her shoulders. Thank you.
I now look to Mr. Akunjee to respond to that.
I'm a lawyer. That's what I'm meant to do. Place the blame where it should be appropriately put. And yes, no one here is asking for sympathy for Shamima Begum's decision. Not asking for that. Her family are not asking for that. What we've been asking for is that justice is done. Emma has spoken about reports about Shamima Begum sewing suicide vests and being part of the Hizbah police. Now, the idea that somebody, a young 15-year-old girl who doesn't speak Arabic, goes out into Syria with a Kalashnikov and lays out the Sharia law in Arabic to Arabic speakers is a bit of a joke. And the reason why that's an important position is because Emma's raised this as if it's evidence, and it is far from that. There are two girls, Shamima Begum and Shamima Begum, both of Bengali heritage, both from East London, both travelling around about the same time, both from the BGA Academy, and unfortunately having phonetically similar names, in a country where women wear full niqabs. To levy evidence or intelligence against one or the other, you must be clear and precise about who has committed these actions. The individuals, plural, who have made these accusations have themselves stated that it may not be even evidence that would stand up in court. It could be old wives nattering in their hairdressers, otherwise known as hearsay, or it could be just somebody making things up. And that's the point. The reason we have trials and we have the testing of evidence is to make sure that we appropriate exactly what evidence we have and apportion it to the person that is actually guilty of the accusation. So Emma's point is an argument for a trial, not against it. And a trial needs to happen here. It needs to happen in the UK, where we have a degree of competency around how we collect evidence, what is classed as evidence, and how we levy evidence. The argument about Shamima Begum being a threat to the UK, well, that is interesting. And the reason I say that is because we have a police force that started in the 1750s. We have a special branch who particularly dealt with terrorists and threats from states like Russia, the Nazis, the Irish terrorists, and Islamic terrorists for decades, even more than a century. We have an MI5 and an MI6 security force that has its inception in 1909. We have one of the most mature security apparatus there is. We've had 400 returnees, some of them men who fought in Syria. They've been assessed by our own Home Secretary's words as having a majority of them being of low risk, meaning that some of them are actually of high risk, or more than low risk, to be more accurate. They are back in the UK. The idea that our mature security service, who is dealing with some of these less than more low-risk individuals, cannot deal with a 19-year-old girl is laughable. And that's what makes this proposition disproportionate. Thank you.
So in a second, we're going to move to audience questions, but first, would either speaker like to pose a question to the other speaker, who will then have a right of response? Yeah, absolutely.
My question is around what you were saying about prevent. In the past, allegedly, you have said that Muslims shouldn't cooperate with the police, and have said that you don't agree with prevent, that you think that prevent is not a good thing. How can you therefore attack the police or Tower Hamlets Council whilst also saying that, you know, they should have fulfilled their safeguarding duties to keep her here, but also at the same time undermining it?
Mr. Akunjee would like to respond?
Yeah, sure. Prevent is a policy. Now, in terms of safeguarding, that wasn't invented when prevent was invented. Safeguarding has been a duty of all our councils since day dot. The issue I have with Tower Hamlets Council is not that they failed to safeguard the girls themselves. That is understandable in the first girl, Shamima Begum. Nobody knew she was going. But when counter-terrorism police are looking at a specific set of girls, in the context where their friend has been radicalized and managed to escape to Syria, then certainly, at the very least, the minimum that should have happened is that these girls' families should have been told their friends managed to escape to Syria. Maybe you want to think about taking their passports away. Maybe you want to keep an eye on them. In fact, the first girl's father, Mr. Uddin, specifically told the police and the school to keep an eye on those three girls, Shamima Begum, Khadija Sultana, and Amira Abbas, because they were so close. So when you have a police force, apparently, the counter-terrorism police, looking into this issue, you have the school looking into this issue, why were the families specifically cut out of that decision-making process? That is a failure. In terms of the prevent strategy and my criticism of it, yeah, certainly I have criticisms of prevent, but not so much contest. They're both part of the government's overall strategy for de-radicalisation. Prevent is on a statutory footing, whereby the idea of what extremism is defined by people ill-equipped in most cases to understand what a particular type of extremism is. For example, when Mark Rowley was asked the difference between Shia and Sunni, him being the head of counter-terrorism policing, he had a very difficult time in terms of explaining that. So if the head of counter-terrorism himself has a difficult time understanding the difference between the basic Shia and Sunni, how do we expect all of our schools and universities to cut up the nuances when it comes to students dealing with these issues? And we've had such issues as students or a 4-year-old child who misspelled cucumber. His teacher thought he said cucumber. He was referred to prevent. 2 children aged 7 and 5 who were talking simply about their parents buying them toy guns for Christmas, they were visited by police. We have the issue of a child who misspelled terrorist house as terrorist house, and then he was referred to prevent and counter-terrorism officers brought to his home. It seems, to my mind, that in terms of what we see with prevent, it's more a tool used against dyslexia than it is against people who represent any sort of threat. But, yeah.
Mr. Akunjee, would you like to pose a question to Ms. Webb?
It has been said of this decision to strip Shamima Begum, a born citizen of the UK, that this in effect creates a 2-tier class of citizenship, where there is British, if your parents are British, and your citizenship is absolutely inviolable. And then there is sub-British, where your parents may have come from another country, and therefore your citizenship is at risk. So my question to Ms. Webb is Is there a two-tier citizenship system, and do you think that's appropriate in a modern state?
Interesting question. I think it's particularly interesting because I find it curious that you seem to have so much faith in our legal system when you've described it as being a Jekyll and Hyde legal system. Do we have a two-tier citizenship? No, we don't. The reason why it's possible to deprive somebody of who have parentage in particular countries of their citizenship is because certain countries have citizenship. You know, you're entitled to citizenship if you have parents from a particular country. So dual nationals are obviously entitled to citizenship in different countries. It's just the law. I mean, it's something that is the law in many countries. And I don't think that it in any way is a sign of a two-tier legal system. I also, having consulted a relatively high legal authority on this, know that if that was thought to be the case, then it would be something that would be dealt with in the courts. It would be something that people could contest if they felt they had been discriminated against in that way. It may look that way as a sort of byproduct of just the nature of how people are entitled to citizenship around the world and the fact that you can't render someone stateless. So if they therefore have citizenship of another country, then they're not rendered stateless if you deprive them of their citizenship. But that's not something that is inherent to the system.
Right, thank you. We're now going to open up the debate to the floor. If you would like to ask a question, please direct it to both of our speakers. Raise your hand and the mic will come to you. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Can we go to the gentleman? Yeah.
Yeah, my question is to the speaker in favor of the motion.
Can you please pose your question to both speakers?
Okay.
So try and make it something that both speakers can respond to.
According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a state, having a state is a human rights. So do you think that, how do you justify that stripping an established citizenship of Britain in apprehension of a far-fetched claim of another country's citizenship is justified? How do you justify this? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we go to Ms. Webb first?
Well, my answer to your question is quite simple. It's because if you're entitled to citizenship in another country, then you can be deprived of your citizenship at, say, in the UK. If it is found when she goes to appeal, as she is going to, she has legal aid to do that. If it's found that she's been de facto rendered stateless, then that will be something that is addressed, because it is illegal to make her stateless, but that isn't what has happened in this decision.
Mr. Akunjee, would you like to respond?
Yes. Well, I'll suggest this. If you have a dual national who's French and British, and the French get in there quickly enough and they strip the national of their French citizenship, despite that person having lived in France all their lives and maybe only just having touched in Britain shortly, how would anyone here respond to that sort of a position? Having people from abroad foisted on you on a technicality of law, a sleight of hand. This is not honourable. This is not politics. This is a situation where each state takes responsibility for its own citizens. Bizarrely enough, we have to look to Donald Trump for the moral high ground on this. He's told us that every state should take their own nationals. Now, we are the 5th biggest economy in the world. We have 65 million people in this country, and we've taken no responsibility for any of our citizens from these camps in Syria. None. Kosovo, the 144th economy in the world, with a population the size of Leeds, has just taken back 110. That should be an embarrassment to us.
Can we go to the... Can we go to the member with the hand up in the white shirt?
Good evening. Thank you for being here. I was wondering, do you believe that humans are inherently born with a moral compass? Because if not, and if it is nurtured through their environment, then that is a possible explanation why a 15-year-old who presumably has some access to the news cycle may still be drawn to join or drawn towards joining ISIS.
Can we look to Mr. Akunjee to answer that one first, please?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think one of the best studies done, direct evidence studies done around this, is entitled The Edge of Violence, when looking at factors around why people go in and have joined the ISIS narrative. And the only explanation that's there, when you factor in for various variables, is just if somebody's friends has gone or not. It's not limited to class or economic background or intelligence necessarily. If we look at what happened here in this case, you have 4 girls who went and joined ISIS, and then you have another 5 who are made wards of court for fear that they would do the same. That is 9 girls from one school in East London. Now, they weren't remarkable, particularly compared to the rest of their classmates, and they weren't remarkable comparably to all the other tens of thousands of children in the schools in that area. They were of a piece. But these girls were affected particularly because of the experience of the first girl. And that's where the safeguarding issues really come in, is when you have an indication that someone's gone, you need to pour resources around that and put the hackles up to make sure that the people around them aren't also similarly sensitized to that situation. I think that's the only answer we're going to get, unless we have a trial around this, where evidence is brought and evidence is heard.
Thank you. Can we now look to Ms. Webb to answer the question?
I think that's a very interesting question. It's an issue, I suppose you're asking really about, it's a question of determinism. People are influenced by the things that surround them. That's how the radicalisation process happens. It drags somebody from point A to point B, and during that travel they don't necessarily notice that they have moved from one position to another. And people are influenced by the things that are around them. I do believe that people are born with an inherent moral compass. And if you don't believe that, then you can't hold people morally accountable, which means that you have to say that people were just influenced by this and they were influenced by that and they were just tossed on the tides of the things that happened around them, and that you can't then hold them morally responsible for what they've done. It's true, people are radicalised. I mean, the famous Milgram study and the question of how people become Nazis, how do people become Islamic State? But they're still morally responsible for their actions, and to have an ordered society, we have to hold them accountable for those actions. And so I think that actually, again, what this boils down to is where are we going to point the finger of blame? And it has to be at the person who has made the decisions to do those things, regardless of what was around them influencing them. They have free will and the ability to choose otherwise.
Can I go to the hand in the front row? Just wait till the mic comes to you.
Hi, thank you so much. There seem to be some contradictory statements on whether we think that the police is competent or not. Does the police struggle with the issue of radicalization, and would admitting Shamima back into the country be an extra strain? Or is it competent enough to face radicalization and maybe further radicalization with the re-entrance of Shamima, and were maybe the terrorist attacks we have witnessed just one event that should have been prevented and could have been prevented and won't happen again?
Thank you. Can we go to Ms. Webb first to respond?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a brilliant question. Again, I think it is quite confusing. Mr. Akunjee seems to think the police were too incompetent to stop her from going out there, but perfectly competent to deal with her if she comes back. The police have been incredibly competent in trying to stop terror attacks, but as we've seen, not entirely, and that's why powers like this exist within our law for the Home Secretary to make decisions like this, is because we cannot let dangerous people flood back in. It's just not safe to do so, and there's a reason why that power exists, and it exists within the law, hence why there is a possibility of an appeals process. I think that, the police are competent, but we shouldn't unnecessarily swamp them and just assume that they can deal with it. We shouldn't be allowing people to come back in who are a danger to our national security when we have the powers to stop them. And if the Home Secretary lets people in who are a danger to our country, people will then be pointing the finger at him when they commit an atrocity here or radicalise more people here. And it is a case of, how we choose to deal with the situation. And I think that given the circumstances, given the fact that if she comes back here, the likelihood is we won't have evidence sufficient to prosecute her properly, that it was entirely the right decision to keep her out and not to unnecessarily burden our police with watching her around the clock. Mr. Akunjee?
The question is, what's she done? What has Shamima Begum actually done? We know that she went and joined a terrorist organisation at the age of 15, and for that there may be criminal sanction. But what has she done when she's out there? Are we going to sit here and put the entire ills of ISIS and what they've done to everyone else and put that collective punishment all on the burden of one 19-year-old woman? I know we feel like doing that. I know that we have had attacks in this country where the population feel that there hasn't been sufficient recourse. It's a similar situation to the Second World War when we tried Lord Haw for his crimes. But that is not justice. It is not taking the ills of others and blaming a young girl for all of their evil. We should have her back so that we can examine what she did and punish her if necessary for what she did, so that we are not denied the knowledge of how does a bunch of young girls get radicalized from the UK and make it all the way to ISIS. We've been denied that opportunity to learn that lesson. Our Home Secretary seems to want to deny that opportunity to save the rest of our 15 and 16-year-old girls from that potential eventuality. And she has been denied the justice of actually being accused of an actual crime, because at the moment she doesn't have a parking ticket to her name, and that is a joke. The issue here is that how can we strip Shamima Begum of her citizenship with the result of her being in a refugee camp with not adequate food, shelter, clothing, her child dying out of it. The result of that is that if you have the Beatles, for example, who are clearly a different category of fish to Shamima Begum, if you strip their citizenship, then the punishment for both is exactly the same. And that cannot be right either. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Can we go to the hand? Yeah, just there.
Hello. I've worked for the Met Police for 15 years in the Child Protection Unit, and I've dealt with lots of grooming cases. My concern is that the cases I've dealt with, our victims have always been victims, and in terms of this person who's been groomed, she's been seen out by organisations like HJS and Civitas. The Islamophobia industry, I call them, have actually been blamed for her circumstances. And it's the wider message that this sends back to the communities, the minority communities within this country, that they are they are not citizens, first-class citizens. And it's that colonial mindset. So my question is, ultimately, how do you resolve the conflicts which are going on with the world without justice and fairness, and treating Shamima as you would treat any other citizen within this country?
Thank you. Mr. Akunjee, can we go to you first?
A state is defined by its justice system and by its currency and by its laws, really. If we don't apply the laws correctly, then we are a failed state. You know, if we are arbitrary in our nature, if we throw out punishments willy-nilly, we don't have a moral high ground. Our allies don't know how to look at us, and our enemies don't know what we're going to do in terms of a capriciousness. If we are a state, we must stand for values, really, and those values are, in the case of citizens, that we take responsibility for our own, for the actions visited by our citizens on other people. The Kurdish state is not a state. They're a ragtag bunch of rebels who are fighting on many fronts. ISIS on one side, the Syrian regime on another, and they don't have a justice system where they are. So which justice system will deal fairly with this problem? Do we trust the Syrian regime, who we say are butchers of their own people, how this entire process started in the first place, who themselves have killed any number of our citizens who've gone out there to help as doctors? Do we trust the Turkish regime over there to deal with Shamima Begum? And if so, why? On what basis? The law that she may have broken there is simply, frankly, a breach of her visa provisions. Do we trust the Kurds, who have no ability and no infrastructure to effect any sort of justice in that situation? The idea that we can have intelligence suggesting that Shamima Begum was involved in sewing vests, being part of the morality police, that we can have that intelligence, but we can't have evidence for a trial, is a nonsense. Where is that intelligence coming from? Why is it not good enough to be evidence for her to face a trial? You can't have your cake and eat it. Either we have information or we don't. Either it reaches the quality of evidence or it doesn't. In this country, justice is bringing evidence against somebody, proving an accusation against them in front of a member of 12 of their peers. And out of that flows justice. Anything other than that, well, that's before the Magna Carta.
It's nothing to do with, and going back to the two-tier question again, nothing to do with Ms. Begum's race or her religion. She's been deprived of her citizenship because she went abroad to join a terrorist group, and the Home Secretary deemed it enough, sufficient, that she should be deprived of her citizenship and not be allowed back in. You're being told that this is not taking place within the bounds of the law, but I repeat again, it is taking place within the bounds of the law. She is able to appeal the decision. This is part of due process. We can go back as many times as you like to Magna Carta and to the processes of the law, but the bigger picture is that this is a woman who chose to go and join an abhorrent terrorist organisation. She chose to go and do that, and she did so knowingly. It is nothing to do with her religion or her race. It would be regardless of that, whoever she was. If she had dual citizenship and she went abroad to join a terrorist organisation and then tried to come back into this country and was deemed to be a security threat, then she could, legally, with the Home Secretary's powers, have her citizenship stripped. We have to keep going back to the bigger picture here. Remember what she chose to go and do. Remember the group that she chose to join. And I repeat again, this is taking place within the legal process. Due process is being followed. That's why Mr. Akunjee is able to hand the case over to another lawyer who can take it to SIAC to appeal it.
I think we have time for one last question. Can we go to the member in the purple shirt? Yeah, you. No, the member in front, yeah.
Good evening. I'm wondering what the two speakers think of proposals to update the treason laws and how that might apply to the case of Shamima Begum.
Can we go to Mr. Akunjee first?
It's interesting because the last time anybody was tried of treason in this country was in 1945, Lord Haw Haw, as he was called. He wasn't really a British citizen. He was born in America, an Anglo-Irish individual who had German citizenship at one point and actually managed to acquire British citizenship by lying. He went over to Germany where he set up a bunch, worked for the Nazis and set up a bunch of propaganda channels, criticizing the US and the UK in the wartime campaign. He was caught on the Dutch-German border. It was a piece of luck where that happened, but somebody recognized his voice and he was arrested. He was then deported against his will back to the UK and faced 3 counts of treason. And the question really in that case was, how could he face a count of treason when he owes no duty to this nation, being an American citizen or a German citizen? But because he had lied, and actually as Lord Shawcross, some descendant of his which would be known to Henry Jackson Society, who argued successfully that because he had availed himself, however he had, of a British passport, he was entitled while abroad to British protection for that period. And because of that, at that point, he owed a fealty to this nation and could be tried. In that case, a fake passport based on lies was used by the British government in order to drag somebody who wasn't a British national back to the UK to face British justice. In this case, the exact reverse has happened, where a British citizen has been denied of their citizenship to keep them away from British justice. The treason laws can apply. In Horhor's case, he was promoting engagement or encouraging people to the enemy, and we have terrorism laws that are similar to that here. No one has any argument as to whether a particular law or another can be applied to Shamima Begum or others of her class. The question is where. It would have to be in a British court in front of a jury of their peers in any event. You have Guy Fawkes, who, if ever there was somebody who was committing treason, it's him. He was indicted. He had a trial. He was found guilty and he was prosecuted. That's all that's being asked for here.
Look to Ms. Webb.
The treason law question is an interesting one. Just to give you some background, Policy Exchange, the think tank in Westminster, recently did a paper proposing the details of how we might be able to update our treason laws so that it can be applied to people who, I think, for example, leak intelligence or act against the interests of this country, and terrorists would fall within that category. And earlier this month, the Home Secretary announced that they were consulting on whether or not they should update the treason laws. I'm not a lawyer, and so I don't know how workable treason laws would be or how likely a jury would be to convict somebody of treason. But I think that the idea of having a specific crime that recognises the wrongfulness of betrayal against your country and exactly how that is harmful and undermines the social fabric of our nation would be a way of ensuring that people who go to join these terrorist groups and people who fall into other categories that would be subsumed within the treason law, that would be a way of ensuring that people could be prosecuted for their betrayal of this country. And if it was the case that we did have treason laws, and it would be ensured that she would, and others like her, would come back and receive a hefty sentence for what they'd done, and I was convinced that justice would be done at home, and that she really would see the consequences of her decisions, then I would be arguing against the motion. But the point is, and this is important, that we don't have such laws. And I don't think that our current counter-terror legislation, though updated as it has been in 2019 and getting better, I don't think that it's sufficient. And this takes me back to my beginning point, which is that the law is a tool that we use to achieve justice. It isn't the same thing. That's why laws change and are updated over time to meet the changing landscape of our world. Otherwise, it would be ossified like Islamic State's law. And that's exactly why I think that the Home Secretary made the right decision. Because if she returns home, 1 in 10 people who have returned have been prosecuted. The likelihood that we can prosecute her in a way that really would serve justice is I think probably unlikely. And the point is as well that the Home Secretary's decision to take away her citizenship is not just about justice for her, it's about protecting the British people from somebody who is being deemed to be a threat. Neither Mr. Akunjee nor I, nor anybody in this room, know what evidence he considered in making that decision. But you can be assured that he had evidence that we don't have and the top legal advice. And if he was wrong, it will go to the Court of Appeal and it will be turned back because it is taking place within our legal system. So that is why I would urge you to vote for the motion that justice has been done.